Basically, I think about identity in terms of dynamic practices of the self that are embodied and relational. I think about this a lot in relation to this notion of care of the self in Foucault's later work, this attempt to move beyond knowledge of the self towards thinking about what kinds of practices one can undertake in order to transform creatively the self in relation to in relation to power as well. In terms of sexual difference, I've been thinking a lot about identity in relation to the work of Luce Irigaray, where she thinks about sexual difference as involving both a fidelity to one's gender or to some kind of essence as a form of horizon, but as a process of becoming that is nonetheless relational. So she talks about becoming man, becoming woman, becoming together. And this question of the relationship between this becoming or this dynamic process, which I sometimes think about in terms of a poetics, as something that's not static, but that is subject to creative transformation in an ongoing sense. That is nonetheless relational in the sense of being involved in relationships with others, with other forms of difference, and that also involves some kind of relationship with what's there to work with, what kinds of materials we have socially, what kinds of discourses we have to draw upon in producing these kinds of creative practices of the self. Thinking about how this concept of becoming in terms of identity both produces new forms of identity and new kinds of shared identities across different groups of people. And then also how becoming inevitably is always in the process of undoing or challenging any categories that can be shared across different groups. Thinking about what kinds of creative practices this might involve always has to recognize the restrictions and the limitations that are imposed on people too. The way in which identity is not, as Chris was talking about, is not just something that is determined by individuals, but that it's something imposed upon them. So this relationship between the way in which we are subject to structures and forms and categories of identity, and the way in which people relate to those categories and structures and can challenge them and transform them and forge new kinds of identities. I've been thinking about breastfeeding in terms of identity and sexual difference, and I find that to be a really interesting way to think about sexual difference and consequently identity, because it's both this very paradigmatically feminine and maternal practice, and yet we can also see how it really challenges when we look at examples of breastfeeding and chest feeding by trans people and genderqueer and gender fluid people, the way in which identity category of feminine or maternal can also be challenged. So I'm really interested in the way in which embodied practices can both serve to reinforce categories of identity, but also can challenge them, so that we have to start to rethink the way in which we understand or assign identities on the basis of biological or physical or physiological processes. So in terms of the possibilities and the limitations of this concept of identity, in my own work, I'm always sort of pushing at identity in terms of how can we destabilize it? How can we think about how it's being challenged or transformed, created in new and different ways? So thinking about identity as becoming. And yet, if you push it too far, or if you push it all the way, it just collapses altogether as a concept of analysis. It really raises the question for me that is there anything stable at all about identity? What could be the basis for identity? If it's continually being transformed, how can we think about the way in which solidarity can be the way in which identity can be the basis for solidarities, social and political solidarities? Can solidarities be grounded in anything? So in relation to the way that Luce Irigaray deploys identity in terms of sexual difference, she plays with this concept of gender as essence when she's talking about gender or essence as a horizon for becoming. And there have been some readers of her work who've described her as carrying out a strategic essentialism. I think this idea of strategic essentialism, or this idea of deploying essentialism as a political strategy, is a bit limited in terms of how she's actually using it in her work. Also, I think it starts to be challenged as we're thinking about gender and its relationship with essentialism as moving beyond binaries of man, woman, male, female. There's limitations as well in thinking about identity as having a relationship to some kind of essence. And if we think instead in terms of becoming and kind of push her work a bit further is what I'm trying to do in my own work, of this becoming together that Irigaray talks about, that we can think about it as a becoming together of people and individuals of a variety of genders beyond just the binary. Generally, though, I think about identity in terms of practices of becoming that are embodied, that are relational, and that can be carried out in different ways by different people with different meanings.